Hi, this is Mark and welcome to my Supabase series. This is video number 3, writing triggers with SupaScript. You can write triggers with any language that PostgreSQL supports on the back end for writing functions, but today we're going to use SupaScript to write those. Those are JavaScript functions. Just to review, SupaScript is JavaScript, Node, Deno-inspired extensions for SupaScript for writing PostgreSQL functions. So if you're a JavaScript developer, you should be able to get up and running writing functions for PostgreSQL really quickly. The first thing you need to do is make sure you have the SupaScript library installed. If you go to the GitHub page, which is listed here, github.com/burgraph/SupaScript, there's a quick install that you need to run in the context of Supabase, and you'll be up and running in 20 or 30 seconds. Okay, so what are triggers? Triggers are PostgreSQL functions that are run by the database, and they're run according to events, insert, update, delete events. So they happen automatically when something else happens. So if you insert a record into your database, your insert function runs. They're super fast because there's no round trip. Typically, when you're working with functions at the server has to go out to the database, get the data, change the data, go back to the server, and then send the results back to you. Well, this is all happening within the database. So if the database catches an event, like an update event, it runs the trigger super fast. It's about the most efficient way you can make changes to your database automatically. So let's take a look at how this works here. I'm going to do a couple of examples, a simple example and then one a little more complex. Okay, so first of all, we're going to create a table in order to create some data and update the data and see how triggers work. So we're going to create a bucket list table. This is just basically a to-do list on steroids because it's more important. Okay, I always create my tables with a UID ID and default it to have it generated automatically. Got a title, some notes, done flag, true or false, then a created time and an update time that are set to the current default time at the server. Okay, so we'll create this table. Great, no problem. And now let's take a look at the trigger syntax. This is how you create triggers. It's typically create trigger, trigger name, and then a before or after the event, and the events can be insert, update, delete on the table name, whatever table you want to create the trigger for. And then typically we just say for each row, and then execute the procedure and give it the name of a procedure, which is really a function. Functions and procedure are pretty much synonymous in PostgreSQL. So here's an example: create a trigger, bucket list trigger before update, and I try to give them very descriptive names, so if I come across them later, I know exactly what they're doing, but you can name them however you want. So this is a trigger before update. On bucket list is the name of our table for each row, and then execute the procedure, and then we have it, give them the procedure name that we want it to run when the bucket list rows are updated. So here's another one, before insert, and then you can also create them on multiple events. In this case, we're saying create a trigger before insert or update or delete. So it'll run on any of those. So you can put a lot of logic in a single trigger, but we're just going to be doing the more simple ones right now. Now, why would you use before update or after update, or before insert or after insert? Typically, if you're working just internally with the table, let's say we're going to update the fields of a table on an insert or an update by running some logic at the server, that's going to be before the update. So basically, the trigger gets a copy of what's about to be written to the database, and then you can manipulate that, and then it gets, when your trigger completes, it writes the new version of the data out. So you're kind of intercepting the data that's coming. You would do it after if you would want to wait until after the data is written to the database and you want to do something. For example, let's say you wanted to send a welcome email to users after they're created. So all you have to do is write a trigger after insert on your users table, and you can have some logic happen after the fact, and then maybe log the fact that you've created that user, run some analytics functions, whatever you want. You would want to do that after, but you don't want to run a trigger after if you're modifying the data in the actual record that you're creating or updating. Hope that makes sense. Okay, so that's the basic syntax. But now remember, there's two things that have to happen. You have to create the trigger and you have to create the function. And you typically want to create the function first and then use a trigger to attach this event, the before update event, to the function that you've written. So let's break it down. First, we'll create. Well, here's a primer on creating functions in SupaScript. Remember, it's create or replace function, function name, and then parameters. In this case, we're not going to use any parameters today. And then the type that it returns is interesting. If you're writing functions for triggers, they return a trigger, as opposed to typically our functions would return text or JSON or int or something like that. And then, of course, language PLV8. And if you're not using SupaScript, you're using just plain old SQL, you could say language SQL or language PL, PG, SQL, whatever. But we're going to be writing these today in SupaScript, so it's always language PLV8. Okay, so let's go ahead and write one. This is a real simple one. Create or replace function bucket list set updated date. So what we're going to basically do here is after we have a bucket list item, if we go and update the item, like we set the date or the done flag from false to true, we want that updated date. Let's go back and look at it. This updated date to be updated. So when we first create it, it's going to default created and updated to the current date. But what we want to do is we want to say when we update, we automatically update that updated date. So we don't have to use any logic on the client or any other server-side logic. It just happens automatically. So here's the logic. We're going to create or replace the function, returns a trigger, language PLV8, and then right in here is our JavaScript code. Very simple. We're using new. New is an object that comes over automatically from PLV8. Old is the old value, new is the new value. So old would be before it gets updated and new is after. If you Google PLV8 triggers, it'll show you that here. That gives you an example of how this works. And also, there's all these special objects you can use, the new and the old. We're just going to be using new because it's pretty simple. Just new is about all you really need to know for most of the cases. There's also this thing called TG, or trigger operation. Remember we said earlier you could write a trigger that works on insert or update or delete, and then inside of there you can do something like if TG op trigger operation is an update, you can do one thing, or if the trigger operation is an insert, do something else. So you can take a look at the PLV8 documentation. That'll give you a lot more information on how all that works. So ours is pretty simple. All we're saying is new represents the record that we're getting in. Updated equals a new date object. So we're just setting it to the current date of the system, and then we're returning new, which is the record. And that's all there is to it. So we're going to go ahead and hit run to create this function. And now the date trigger, this is where the magic happens. We're going to create the trigger bucket list trigger before update, and it happens before the update. So it's just before the data gets written to the database on the update, only on the bucket list table for each row, and execute this procedure that we just created right here. So once I do this, we're just basically saying, okay, now for every update, run this procedure just before it gets written. Okay, so let's give it a try. We're going to insert some data into bucket list. We're going to insert 4 records here real quickly, and all I'm going to insert is the title of, and we'll take all the defaults for everything else. Okay, and so then we're going to take a look at our data. Select star from bucket list, order by updated descending. And you'll notice here that go skydiving is the last one. It was the last one we inserted in the list. But of all these things, all these bucket list items, the only one that I've done so far is go skydiving. Not willingly, but that's another story. I've done that, so let's go ahead and set that as done. So we're going to update bucket list, set done equals true, where title equals go skydiving. Very straightforward. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now 2 things should have happened. The done flag should be set to true now, and the updated date should be set. And so now if we go back, let's go back to view the data. We're going to run this again. You'll notice that go skydiving, since we're ordering by updated descending, came up to the top. There's our done flag is set to true. And then if you want to take a look here, the created date and the updated dates should now be the created date should be the same, but the updated date should be a later date. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so it's 2014 and 2054. So our updated date has been updated automatically. So the trigger worked. Very, very simple. Now let's do something a lot more fun. This is something that you might use for sending emails or pretty much anything. We're going to use the HTTP GET command that we used in our previous video to show that we can go out to the web and do things. I wouldn't recommend doing stuff like this at scale if you're inserting hundreds of records a second, because it's going to slow your database down. But on individual records, if you need to go out and do stuff like creating users, things like that, this would be just fine. Okay, so here's our create or replace function bucket list set title. What we're going to say is if new.title equals null. So what we're doing here is we're saying if I forget to add a title or I don't want to add a title, I'm going to go out and choose something for you to do on your bucket list. Okay. In order to do that, I found this cool website with an open API called www.boardapi.com/API/activity. So it randomly assigns you an activity, and then we return the content. And then when I first wrote this, it wasn't working right because content.activity it looks like a JSON object, but it's really a string that looks like a JSON object. So what we're going to do is we're going to get the random item over the net randomly for each record here, and then we're going to parse it using JSON parse, and that turns it into a JSON object. And then we're going to pull out the activity. There's a whole bunch of fields, but you can check out this API. There's a whole bunch of cool stuff you can do with it. So we're going to say new.title. So the title of the new record that we're creating is going to be the parsed item activity that we got from the board API. So we're going out to the web, grabbing a record, making it into a JSON object, pulling something out of the JSON object, setting it to the title, and then returning new. And so this is all happening just before we insert the record. And it's only happening if we forget or we don't put in a title. And then I'm wrapping this in a try-catch block just in case this doesn't work. Then we're putting the oops, could not get a random activity message in the database for you. So let's go ahead and run this. And then remember, we need to add it before insert on bucket list. So this is actually creating the trigger, attaching it to the function that we created. Now let's go ahead and insert some more records. We're going to insert 3 records, but I'm not going to insert the title. I want to leave that null so our trigger executes. I'm going to insert in the notes. You pick it for me just so we can see that those are the new records. So I'm going to go ahead and run this here. And you'll notice it took a little longer this time to run the trigger because for each one it was going out to the web, getting that data, inserting it, and saving it. So the lag time was because our server had to talk to the board API server for each one. It was still pretty fast, but it wasn't nearly as fast as normally inserting data. Okay, so now we're going to select star from bucket list, order by updated descending, and here's our last 3 records here. You pick it for me. There's the notes that we inserted, and then let's see what we got. Look at pictures and videos of cute animals. That's an easy one. Let's see. Look at your finances and find one way to save money, and write a note of appreciation to someone. Those are great bucket list items. I'm so glad that we added those. Okay, so that is writing triggers in SupaScript. Hopefully you'll enjoy writing in JavaScript. It's very easy. You can get going very quickly. And you'll find that triggers are super powerful. The more you write them, the more you're going to really enjoy working with PostgreSQL. This has been Mark, and this is my Supabase series.